Hello, everybody. Hi, hello, and welcome to the RollPlay lecture series. This is a course of 12 lectures with an accompanying Q&A period at the end, which are going to discuss the various skills and practices that make up game mastering. I'm Adam Coble. I'm going to be your lecturer for today and for the rest of these as well, I imagine, unless somebody wants to pinch hit for me. Some random game master wants to step in and do one of these. That'd be cool, but for now, you and I, we're here together. Like I said, there's going to be about 45 minutes of lecture. I've got a little presentation. I've got some information to give you, and then an informal Q&A period if we have questions at the end. If you do have questions, hold on to them till the end. I do have, if you're watching this live, I do have the chat open, so I can see the conversation, but we'll save all the questions to the last bit, and then we can chat about the topic or whatever else you've thought of that's come up as we go through. So before we get started, obviously I want to thank our patrons. That's you. Thank you for your support, without which this lecture series and all the other cool stuff we do would not be possible. You can find out more about that at patreon.com/roleplay. So today, what we're going to be talking about as the topic of our second lecture is how to choose the right game, which I think is a topic that often goes unremarked upon, right? I think that often people think, well, the right game is whatever game is fun or whatever game we feel like playing. And I think that a lot of the problems that we can run into as game masters with our group and just on our own doing prep and having a good time that way can stem from choosing the wrong game. I think that if you pick the wrong game, you're setting out on a very uncomfortable foot for your campaign. So we're going to help you not have that problem. That's the plan anyway. So when we want to start a new campaign, we've sat down with our group, whether they're a brand new group we've never played with before, or whether it's that group that we've been playing with since we were kids, whether we're playing at home or playing online, whether we're streaming on Twitch or whether it's just for us, whatever the venue, whatever the innate details, at some point in the process, we have to sit down and decide what rule set we're going to use to craft our brand new campaign. We're going to pick the game. And for every group, this process begins at a different place. Sometimes it's very early. Other times it's later on. I'm going to try to give you a framework for knowing when to start talking about the game, at least how I usually do it, because I find that not only choosing the right game is important, but knowing when to choose it, right? When you have the information that you need and when you're able to make this choice intelligently. So when we make this decision, somebody inevitably brings up the point like, all right, what are we going to play? We sit down to consider our options. We have so many RPGs to choose from. We could play 5th edition or 4th edition or 3rd and a half edition, or we could really go out there. We could really go out on a limb. We could play Pathfinder. What a world we live in where there are so many good role-playing games to choose from. Any of these various editions of the world's most popular role-playing game will give us hours and hours of fun doing swords and sorcery type things and having an exciting adventure, right? D&D and its friends have the most cultural momentum, the biggest marketing departments, and honestly, the largest player base. So most of the time, when people sit down to play a role-playing game, especially people who are new to the hobby, they will think of RPGs, and their mind will go to one of these. Some variant of Dungeons & Dragons. This is the place where most campaigns begin. Right? And because of all of those things, this is why we so often equate RPGs as a concept with some variation of Dungeons & Dragons. Usually the first versions of Dungeons & Dragons that we get our hands on. But not all of the stories we want to tell are fantasy adventure stories, right? Sometimes we want to make up a narrative about a crew of a sci-fi spaceship, or maybe we want to tell a detective story set in a gritty urban landscape. Maybe we want to tell stories about cyberpunk operatives falling in love with each other in foreign countries and losing their limbs. To do any of that stuff, we're going to need the right tool set, right? We're going to need a set of tools that is capable of something different than what D&D and its friends can put together. So if we're already familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, if we already love D&D, and if our players already want to play D&D, why not just hack or retool it, right? Why not just take D&D and throw a different coat of paint on it? Why not rename the wizard the Techno Sorcerer? Why not rename the fighter the Street Samurai and turn bows into guns? There you go, right? That's all you need. You can take a game you already love and you can just turn it into something different. Because the group already loves a specific flavor of D&D. They're comfortable, they're familiar, and the only reason that we would ever play anything else would be because we want to play a new game, right? Except that D&D is more than just a conflict resolution engine. I think that the approach that some people take, where they think that they can repurpose Dungeons & Dragons, or honestly any role-playing game, you can insert your favorite RPG here. If you think that you can repurpose any RPG to do any other thing, you're doing your campaign a disservice, but you're also doing the game a disservice. D&D is actually quite good at D&D type stuff, and it's not really worth it trying to drag Dungeons & Dragons away from the stuff it doesn't want to do. Right? There's no reason to do that. It's going to cause a lot of stress for us having to rebuild something that doesn't want to be rebuilt, and it's going to essentially break D&D. Right? If you want to do courtly intrigue and drama, you're going to need to look elsewhere. I think the trick that we run into is that using Dungeons & Dragons, a familiar tool, to do something it's not meant to do is a bit like using a chainsaw to give somebody a haircut. Like, you can do it, but it's going to be messy. So you want to pick the right tool for the right job. Back in 2004, in an article called System Does Matter, RPG theorist and game author Ron Edwards proposed that no matter how good your GM might be, no matter how cohesive a group is, an additional form of creative agenda and momentum gets injected into your game by the system. So what Ron meant by system in this case means he meant a method to resolve what happens during play. Right? A system is just that. It's when the players say something, what does the game do in response to that something? Right? If your players have a specific creative agenda, right, to tell an engaging story, to engage in a deep tactical combat simulation, to explore a world not their own, the system of the game should match up with that agenda, right? We should be playing a game whose mechanisms flow in the same direction as our own creative desires. Because otherwise we're paddling upstream. We're putting in more effort to overcome the game that we could be using to make the game fun and entertaining. If we want a game about fighting, the system should provide us rules for fighting. A game about telling stories about romance should have ways to connect the PCs together and to NPCs, and for building and engaging their heart's desires. For example, in a game about stabbing people, the system will provide deep and cogent interconnected mechanisms for the resolution of stabbing, right? We should be able to look at the rules, and we should be able to understand when it is or isn't advantageous to do a stabbing. We can know with some degree of comfort that our stabbing implement is relevant, it matters. We're going to know that our target matters, that maybe the target has the ability to stab us back. We're going to know what to expect from a counter stabbing, and the system will likely reward us for stabbing each other successfully. Right? The game, in effect, gives a shit about things like knives and blood and stabbing. It's a game about that. But in a game about stabbing people, if you decide instead you want to just lay a big wet one on your opponent, what will the system have to say? Probably nothing. Because this is a game about stabbing people, not smooching them. We may, as players of a game and creative individuals and improvisers, still be able to navigate a scene about smooching, perhaps even satisfactorily. We might have fun having a wonderful time describing our smooching even in the midst of this stabbing people, but that can lead to this. You hear this a lot. This is a statement that gets made often in praise of a good role-playing experience. This is a phrase that is often made when people have a really great time doing the smooching in the game of stabbing, right? Playing a game without engaging the systems of the game means you're not really playing the game at all. Yes, we can have fun and a good time and enjoy ourselves freeform narrating something that happens outside the systemic elements of the game, and we can fill the spaces the game doesn't fill for us with the rules. But if we're just juking around the game the whole session, we're doing ourselves a disservice and probably not playing the right game. So how do we choose the correct game for our group? How do we get to that place? So the first and best possible thing you can do when choosing the right game is to sit down with your players before you've even done anything else and have what I call a session zero. Now, we're going to dedicate an entire lecture, I think, later to session zero as a concept, how to have a really good one, what goes into a session zero. We'll talk about the various tools you can use. But for now, understanding that this is the part of the game that might be 10 minutes, it might be an hour, it might be 4 hours, or in my case, up to 8 hours of pregame. But it sets the stage for your whole campaign to come, right? Session zero is what happens before you really dig into the game at large. And the idea here is that you're going to set aside some time to do non-play activities without taking on various roles within the game that are going to warm you up and prepare you for the game itself. You're going to answer questions that will help you understand how you want to engage in the game that you're about to play. We're going to talk more about this later, of course, but for now, we're going to focus on, during session zero, what you can do to make sure you're picking the right game. And the first place to start is with inspiration. And I don't mean the D&D mechanism. I mean actual meaningful inspiration. What kinds of things are you feeling inspired by right now, right? Sit down, maybe over drinks, grab a beer, get some pizza, eat a head of cauliflower. I don't care. Whatever you do, sit down in an informal way and say, what kinds of things are you feeling inspired by, right? What books, what movies, what comics, what TV shows? What has got your blood pumping, right? Is everyone in the group really excited about playing teenage superheroes, right? Did the GM just read a really good sci-fi book and wants to share the themes of that story of galactic struggle, right? Did two players just discover some niche historical drama that they're really fired up about? This is a great place to start, because not only can you share information, right? Not only can you say, I would like to play a game about vampires, but you just get to start the campaign on a fun note. Everybody gets a chance to talk excitedly about something they're passionate about. This is why I think the just to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, this is why I think that the role play pre-shows are so important to the process. This is why I think that we would do ourselves a disservice to cut them, because in a way, we're getting ourselves fired up. Not only are we just talking about what video games we're playing or what TVs or TV shows or movies we're watching, but we're giving ourselves an opportunity to share with each other things that we are feeling high energy about. So starting a campaign by saying, what is everybody stoked on, gets everybody into a mindset where you are positive and excited, right? So this is good just for that. Even if you don't end up playing that Iron Man, Game of Thrones, Ghost in the Shell mashup that you have in your brain, you still get to talk about those things, and you get to dissect them and understand why you're excited about them. It's really a great brainstorming aspect of session zero, and it can help you not only choose the game, but it can help you organize player roles, because usually the person who is the most fired up, usually the person who is the most inspired, will end up taking on the role of the GM if that hasn't already been decided. Excuse me. So the most important thing that we want to do right here is pick a game that's fun, right? Who doesn't love fun? The only real thing that defines one game against another is that it is fun. Fun games are good and not fun games are bad, right? No. The thing about this is that you cannot derive fun from a game. You cannot look at a game, you can't talk about a game and say, this game is fun. Now, you can understand your own design preferences. You can know what your players like doing, and you could probably assume whether a game will be fun for that group. But fun is a byproduct of play. Fun comes from playing, and it's great to talk during session 0 about what you think might be fun, but there's no such thing as a fun game inherently, right? Scenarios, characters, situations that feel like they might be fun, games we've played before that we had fun playing, that's good, right? Be specific about those conversations. I might have had fun playing a very simulationist game about medieval France, but maybe I've moved away from that and I want a narrativist game about giant robots. What sounds like fun, what could be fun, all the hopes and dreams we put into our future campaign, now is the time to talk about that. Don't try to decide whether a game is fun or not now, but do share previous experiences and try to derive an understanding of what each player might aspire to. Fun is an aspiration, right? The right game, whatever it is going to be able to support and empower the fun we will inevitably have together. So when we sit down and we establish what we're excited about and we talk about what feels like it might be fun for us, we'll probably have some idea of something that looks kind of like a character concept, but for our whole game. A simple phrase that might describe the kind of narrative we're looking to play. It might include themes, it might include genre, or it might not, right? You may end up with something like, we want to play members of a mysterious order of sorcerers protecting the world from supernatural threats. Or we want to play edgy 90s superheroes who are allies as often as they are rivals. Or we want to play an 18th century courtly drama of high romance and politics. Or it might be something simpler. We want to play a game full of violence in a contemporary setting. Or we might want to play a pastoral game that is gentle. Wherever you end up, it's going to be the guiding concept for the next stuff, right? You're going to want to find a game that will fit into that. So how do we do that, right? What do we look for when we're picking games? When you go to your library or you go to drive-thru or you go to your local game store, you start flipping through books trying to find a game, what should you be looking for? Because that's the practical stuff, right? You can conceptualize with your friends as much as you like, but until you know and have the tools for defining what's going to make the game work for you, you're still basically taking shots in the dark. So first, we're going to talk about a couple of common ways that we can divide games from one another, and then we'll dive into how best to understand what games will serve our group's fun agenda, right? How to resolve that concept. And as we look at these points, as game masters, we're looking for tools that are going to help us do our best job as the GM, right? To best serve that campaign concept. So often when we try to differentiate one game from another, this is the very first place that we're going to look, right? We're going to look at setting. Setting can mean a lot of things. Usually when you ask somebody about setting, they will say something like The Forgotten Realms, or Middle Earth, or Los Angeles in the year 2099, right? But it can encompass a broader spectrum of other things as well. The first and most prevalent aspect, obviously, of setting is place, right? The literal set of the game, right? This is our backdrop. Does the game have a deep set of its own lore, or is it more like a framework, right? Compare and contrast something like Ravenloft with Dungeon World, right? Implied setting versus built-in setting. How much are you interested in engaging with? Remember that the more specific your concept is, the more it's going to clash with a specific setting, right? If you want to play a game about high adventure fantasy, but you want there to be spaceships and aliens, you're going to have a hard time jamming that into Ravenloft versus making something like Dungeon World fit. Now, if you have a broader idea of medieval fantasy, you might be able to pick a setting that's going to support that, right? Maybe it's Ravenloft. Is the game set somewhere that matches your character, your character concept for your campaign, right? Sci-fi space station, sprawling fantasy metropolis. Is the game setting broad and wide, or is it tight and focused? In this case, say, compare Blades in the Dark to the Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms, you have dozens of cities to choose from. You have wilderness, you have deserts, you have cultures of all kinds. Blades in the Dark, you have Duskfall, right? You have one city that is broken out into districts. Think about scale when you're looking at the setting of a game. This is going to give us an idea of the scope of our stories and how much the players and the characters might be able to interact with the world. Now, setting is also about what's going on in the world, right? Setting is action. It's not just neutral set pieces, right? A peaceful kingdom, as the setting of your game, might not have opportunities for a band of bloodthirsty mercenaries, but might fit right in for an anime-style slice-of-life drama, right? Setting is as much about what's happening in the place as it is about the place itself. Middle-earth, for example, is very different, action-wise, in the Second Age from what we see kind of late in Lord of the Rings. The ongoing conflict and action in the setting matter. Look for things in the game world that align with your preferences in terms of action, not just place. If you read a campaign setting and you can't find anything going on in that world, you know that it's going to be your job to stir things up. If a campaign setting provides merely a status quo with no ongoing action, you as the group have to create that action, which can be fun. Obviously, it's fun to shake things up, but it's also a different kind of work. These kinds of things together, right, setting and scenario, will help you understand genre. Genre is a loose collection of fictional rules and objects that we put together to better establish a shorthand for understanding what we can expect from the stories in that setting. Now, genre is very, very loose because what one person might define as a certain genre, someone else will have a completely different idea. The Expanse, Dune, Neuromancer, they're all technically science fiction, but they're very different stories. So genre, setting, and scenario are the loosest measure that a game can use to tell you what it's about. So the next place we look in terms of whether or not this is a game for us, the thing that pairs up with setting, is rules. And often the question first and foremost in our mind is this a rules light game or is this a rules heavy game? Now, I think this is dramatically reductive. I think that there are games with few rules that are rules heavy, and there are games with many rules that are rules light. But this is a way that we can understand games at a glance, right? What kind of game experience is your group looking for? Do you want one where the rules are broad and deep and the rules have lots to say about a wide variety of situations? Or do you want something lighter where the players or the GM have to fill in the gaps in the rules, right? Are you looking for something that's going to last you years of mechanical exploration? Or are you looking for something that you can do a one-shot of? How many sessions do you want to play, right? Are you going to get bored of the rules before you finish the campaign? How much can you expand and learn? Now, this can help you understand, too, how many rule books you want to buy. If a game has 128-page rule book, that's going to be a very, very different campaign experience than if it has 100 400-page rule books. I don't think even the longest game has that many. I think AD&D has the most rule books of any game, and they're mostly monster manuals. Anyway, look at that. Look at the library of the game. Look at how much you need to play, how much you need to learn. Talk about this priority with your group, right? This isn't always about page count, but you want to understand that priority with your players. How much are they going to work to learn the game? And keep that in mind when you're sorting out what game to pair up with your concept. Now, when you're looking at the rules, it's not just about looking at how many rules there are. The real work comes from looking at what kind of rules there are. And one tool, going back to Ron Edwards, one tool that the Forge developed that'll help us in understanding what kind of rules to pair up with our players is the GNS model. So GNS stands for Gamist, Narrativist, and Simulationist. And in that same System Does Matter post, Ron lays out 3 functional priorities of players. And these are player priorities, Game mechanisms can appeal to one or more of these, but I find it really useful to understand players as being predominantly one of these three kind of classes of players. And each one will tell you what that player prioritizes so that you can go looking for rules that will help them get what they want, right? This is a way of a player saying, these are the kinds of things that I need to have a good time in a game. This is the kind of stuff that I'm most satisfied with. So each of these types will gravitate towards games that fulfill their desires as players. Now, sit down and talk about this as a group. Don't try to guess what kind of players you have. Having a player self-identify can help us figure out what kind of games that we want to play, right? And keep in mind, they're not absolutes. We'll see players mix and match. They're going to merge various styles. And that one player might be satisfied by a gamist experience in one campaign, and they might want to play with a narrativist approach in another. Like, for example, for me, when I'm a player, especially in games like Dungeons and Dragons, I'm a very directly gamist player, right? I want to know how the game works. I want to win because I want to engage the mechanisms in the way I'm supposed to. I want to win the game. I want the most experience points. But as a GM, I'm much more a narrativist when I approach. Mastery of the system exists only to help me compose a greater narrative. I bet you if you think about the various casts of roleplay, you can figure out who's what. Right? I think it'd be fairly easy to assign a G, an N, or an S to any member of any show if you're familiar with them. I think it's a pretty, I mean, obviously you can't strictly control that a player is one of three things, but I think it's a really great way of looking at what players prioritize. Help you pick a game that way. Now, it may go without saying, but the other thing that we often prioritize, especially in the eyes of an inexperienced player, is, do I already know how to play this game or a game like it, right? Even a question like, do I already own all the books for this game, can override any other thing. People will defer to games they are familiar with, even if they don't necessarily want to play them again, right? I spent $180 on Dungeons and Dragons books, and I don't want to learn Apocalypse World because I already have all these D&D books, and I spent a year learning how to play D&D. Can't we just play D&D again? Right? Sure, you may have the desire in your heart to play a 4-color superhero game, but that $200 worth of D&D books is really going to weigh on you, and so maybe we could just try to make D&D do superheroes? It's a fiscal and an emotional comfort level safety net, but it's one worth understanding and respecting as well, right? Like, not everyone can expend time and energy to learn a new system. So asking your players, do we want to learn something new, and how are we going to do that as a group, I think is a responsible thing to do. I think it's important to have that conversation because not everybody can afford to get into a new game. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to get around that later. One question that I find players asking all the time, and I get this as someone who makes and sells games. I hate this question. I hate it because I think it's on the one hand, it's completely ridiculous, but on the other hand, I think it's going to come up. What kind of resolution system does this game use, and why does that matter? Right? People will come up to me when I'm selling copies of Burning Wheel or Dungeon World at Gen Con, and they'll say, "So is this like just use D20s or like a White Wolf, like D10s? What's the system?" I tend to prefer games whose system is built for that game. But again, this is a comfort level thing. People want to know that the game that they're playing has some kind of connection to a game they've already played or are familiar with. I think that mechanically, the system that a game uses, which is to say, like, what dice does it use? Does it use target numbers? Is it a dice pool system? It's irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. You can do a lot of different things with a similar conflict resolution, right? The gentle curve of 2d6 can be used to resolve a bunch of things, just like the chaotic randomness of a d20 roll can. Dice pools, a bunch of polyhedrals, cards, whatever can be the basis of a game system. It doesn't really matter. The reason that it might actually be relevant, the reason why you might actually care about this, is that it's a kinetic thing. It's a thing at the table. Players might like rolling big handfuls of dice, right? So all else being equal, if you're a big dice pools kind of guy, if you want to grab those dice and throw 46 of them on the table, you're going to appeal to a system like Shadowrun or Exalted, right? Games that do that. And it's a very niche, very physical need in a game. And I think it's valid, but not nearly as valid as any of the other things we have, but it's going to come up. People are going to ask, right? The other thing is, if you want a game that feels a certain way and you have an understanding of how the dice can affect that, it might be worth knowing, right? A game that uses an unmodified D20 is going to have much less result certainty than a game that uses a bunch of D6s. If your brain works totally unlike mine and you can work out how math and certainty work in a game, this might be worth understanding. But for the most part, please do not let a game's dice pool or dice type turn you off. A big anecdote for me on this one is the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game, the Genesis system. They use custom dice, which I think turn a lot of people off. I think a lot of people look at them and they're like, these dice don't have numbers on them. And they miss out on what I think is fundamentally a very strong system. So be willing to try new stuff. Just because a game uses a deck of cards instead of dice, don't disregard that system off the bat. Try something new. So when we're looking at a game, either individually or as a group, what do we want to know about a game that's going to let us understand it enough to decide if it's right for our table, right? We understand our agenda, right? Picking a game whose setting, whose rule depth, and priorities align with our own. We know what we want to do, but how do we do that? How can we look at a game and say, yes, this game will be good, right? Functionally, the next section of this lecture is going to be about doing what we set out to do. I want to give you the tools to understand role-playing games, to pick up a game at home or at your game store, know where to look, know what to look for, and know how to know if this game is going to fit your group without having to read it all the way through and play it, right? Because these games are long and often tedious to read. So I want to give you as much of a fast track as I can to do that. And to help you, I'm going to enlist my good friend Jared. So Jared Sorensen, designer of Inspectors, along with some other people, designed 3 questions. He came up with 3 questions. Now, these questions were originally proposed as a method for designers to understand their own work, but I think you can absolutely use them to better understand a game you're reading with the intention of playing it. I found Jared's questions particularly helpful when understanding design in general. And I think the better we understand design, the better we understand games, the more we can pick the games that work for us. Looking at any game through this lens, any RPG through this lens, is going to help you know the answer to the most important question: is this game going to support my group and our priorities as players, as well as avoiding the biggest lies that a game will tell you. So Jared's first question is, what is this game about? What does the game tell you directly that it is about? Now, you can get this information from the fiction. You can get it from the marketing text on the back of the book. You can get it from the art. These are things that the publisher of the game is directly saying. Let's look at some examples. The Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game is about storytelling in worlds of swords and sorcery. It shares elements with childhood games of make-believe. Like those games, D&D is driven by imagination. It's about picturing the towering castle beneath the stormy night sky and imagining how a fantasy adventurer might react to the challenges that scene presents. Does this mesh with your understanding of 5th edition D&D? Knowing the rules of D&D, do you think that this fits? Have you had this experience playing D&D? If you saw this picture in a book, would you expect that your character would be able to play out this scene and that the game would give you tools for resolving it? Nobody remembers how or why. Maybe nobody ever knew. The oldest living survivors have childhood memories of it. Cities burning, society in chaos, then collapse. Families set to panicked flight. The weird nights when the smoldering sky made midnight into a blood-colored half-day. Now the world is not what it once was. Look around you. Evidently, certainly not what it was. But also close your eyes. Open your brain. Something is wrong. At the limits of perception, something howling, ever-present, full of hate and terror. From this, the world's psychic maelstrom, we none of us have shelter. Does this give you an impression of what kind of game this might be? Right? Can this tell you whether or not this will fit your understanding of what your group needs for a game? Does this art evoke the same images and ideas? Does that have the same energy as the text that we just read? What do you think this game is about? Right? What kinds of things do you expect to do in a game whose back text says, for centuries, supernatural powers have reigned, warring amongst themselves, culling the human herds and lashing out from the shadows. The creatures of the night have held court since before the dawn of history. Nothing lasts forever. Now, I like Hunter in this case particularly because just this image just screams something specific. The font choice, the fact that the cover is on fire. This is a very aggressive statement. This is the back text of Hunter the Reckoning. And you can find within it some art that indicates what the game might be about. Have you ever killed a zombie with a phone? Now you can. So art, text, presentation are the first step towards understanding what a game is about. This is the first thing we see when we flip through a game. You'll notice this is all surface level stuff. All of that text either came from the back of the book or like the first page. And the art is either the cover or random art therein. These things are massively important to people who design and publish games because they're the first thing that we see and they're the first thing we're going to bounce off of. If I saw this art in a game, I would probably think, okay, this game is not for me, which does a disservice to the game because Hunter is not like this in play. And that's because role-playing games will lie to you. Role-playing games will flat out say that they are about one thing and do another. They'll do this for lots of reasons, right? They'll do it because they don't know any better. They'll do it because the designer's aspirations don't match the design. They'll do it because they just want you to buy their game and no other games. Games will lie to you about what they are about in a lot of different ways, right? They're going to portray characters, scenarios, and situations in their art that simply cannot occur in the game. Now, this might be small. You want to hear this is my pet peeve. Even games that I love, even games I love deeply have done this. It might be like a little thing, like showing an elf fighting two-handed with scimitars when the rules of the game clearly state you cannot dual-wield scimitars, right? It might be big, like in Hunter, with all of the art portraying action and adventure and bloodshed and chainsaws and shit, but the actual game itself is about terror and vulnerability. Games will lie to you by telling you long-winded stories about what the characters might get up to, but then never provide mechanisms for those actions. Right? This is like if the game about stabbing had a long story about two assassins falling in love. The game has no rules for that. All those assassins can do is stab each other to death. A game might tell you, you can do anything with this system. A game might say, this is a system with easy-to-learn rules. A game might tell you, this is the last RPG you'll ever need to buy. All of those things will be lies. Now, you can watch, and this is a tricky one too, you can watch other people play these games on Twitch or YouTube. You can hear about their experiences in actual play posts, and then you'll go and you'll buy the game and you'll sit down at your table and you'll play it and you will have a completely different experience because every session is an amalgam of players and the game. right? Now, this isn't really the game's fault. This is just how this works. But I wonder about groups who watch Critical Role or Court of Swords or Roll20 Presents and then have a totally different experience. And I hope that they don't feel burned by that. I think that we underestimate how much we as players change the game. So what a game might appear to be on the surface might not actually be what the game is about. So let's look at Jared's second question to help us figure out how is the game about that, right? This is the calling bullshit on the game's claim. If a game tells you it is a personal storytelling game of personal horror, how? Prove it. This is us looking at the game and saying, put your money where your mouth is, designer, because a bad game says one thing and does another. A good game backs up its art, its text, and its promises with mechanisms. If a game is about fantasy adventure, the rules will be about that as well. It'll give you the tools you need to create a narrative that matches that experience. So a good game will have art that you can look at a glance in the game store and say, wait, this looks cool. My players want it to be dwarves and elves and wizards. They look like they're having a gritty fantasy adventure. Look at how exhausted and battered these adventurers are. Okay, this looks cool. Let's look for mechanisms in the game that will support the things that we want. Will support that creative agenda, right? So a good way to get a very brief surface level understanding about what a game is about is page count. Now, this is obviously a bit reductive because most pages doesn't always mean most important, or else the skill of dungeon mastering would be all about magic items and being a PC would be all about casting spells. But it can be a really quick way to judge what a game cares the most about, right? The more rules a game has to define a situation, the louder the game's voice will be about that topic at the table. You want the game to be talking about the same things you care about, right? So page count is a nice way to get a handle on that. Look at the various discrete rules in a game and what they'll cover, right? Take a look at the table of contents. Is there a subsection for social conflict? Cool, that tells you something about the game. Is there a subsection for starship navigation? Okay, that's important to this game. If you have a chance to read the whole book, make note of what the authors care enough about to write rules for and what they hand wave, right? This is going to let you know how much work you're going to have to fill in the gaps with your players, right? How much are you going to have to do to make up for the game's lack of rules in those places? This is the way that designers put their mechanisms where their mouth is, right? A game about personal angst should have a way to record, manage, and mechanize that angst in play. It should be angst forward. Now I'm going to give you this is my number one tip. The very first thing I do to answer Jared's third question, the very first thing I do when I pick up a role-playing game, no matter what, this is always the first section I look at. I will skip everything else in the game and I will look at what the game encourages and rewards directly. I will jump right to experience or karma or whatever the game calls its reward cycle. If the game rewards a player for doing something, that means it wants the player to do that thing more often, right? Easy. Sometimes the reward systems are clear and obvious, like XP. Do one thing, get points. Do a different thing, get more points. Sometimes reward is less obvious, which we'll talk about at the end. But let's look at a couple of examples of rewards, and we'll guess what these games are about. When the adventure is over, the DM gives experience points to surviving characters. Experience points are given for non-magical treasure and for defeating monsters. For every 1 GP value of non-magical treasure the characters recover, the DM should give 1 XP to the party, divided amongst all the player characters. Experience points are not given for magic items. The characters will divide the treasure amongst themselves, but the DM handles all the experience. This is a very clear reward system. Get money, get XP. Defeat monsters, get XP. Right? If I were in a situation in this game where I wasn't sure what to do, I would know my priorities are to recover gold and to defeat monsters. It would be my hope that the rest of the system's mechanisms empower me to get gold, to fight monsters, and the way the game challenges me would be to put obstacles between me and that sweet, sweet gold. Now, this is from Moldvay Dungeons & Dragons. It indeed does those things. Now, the first point of XP on this list, I will always roll my eyes at. Showing up isn't something worth rewarding with XP in my eyes, but I guess it does create a steady universal advancement approach, right? Just being here. But I do really like the style of question and answers XP. Now, this example comes from Modiphius's sci-fi game Coriolis, but you'll also see it in Dungeon World. You'll see it in Blades in the Dark. It is a way to reflect on the fiction that you just participated in and give out XP for specific stuff, right? This game ties the reward structure directly to in-game action, right? We can tell that Coriolis is a game about risking things for your crew, putting your crew at risk because of your personal problems, acting in accordance with your icons, and overcoming universal challenges, right? It's pretty nice. This is a pretty clear layout of what we should do in a session. If we're not doing this stuff, there's a problem with the game, but this is what the game is about. Now, we can get even more specific, and we can look at Burning Wheel, right? A game like Burning Wheel has differing levels of reward that are more or less difficult to obtain, but they tell us exactly what we need to push the game forward. It is a beautifully granular system, and while you won't see this level of nuance in every game, because God knows they don't all need it, it's a good example of a game that has a very specific purpose and expects to reward you for playing according to that purpose. Generally, the looser the XP model, the less the game cares about what you do with it. A game like Burning Wheel really wants you to do these specific things and only really works if you're doing them. A game that just says, show up and get experience points isn't a game that's really about anything. Certainly not from the point of view of encouragement or reward. Based solely on this text, I can only assume this game doesn't really give a shit what we do from session to session. Now, I will talk about this. When you're reading the mechanisms of a game, look for certainty. This is going to be the graduate level part of the lecture, all right? So if you are brand new to role-playing games, if you're just getting started, this is going to feel like it's a little over your head, probably. And that's okay. That's fine. You can come back to it. But I want to talk about it right now because I want people to understand how this affects mechanisms in play. Because we see this... I've been thinking about it a lot because of a conversation I had with Zeke after an episode of Court of Swords. So Zeke told me, you know, I'm feeling a little... And Max has had this problem too. I'm feeling a little frustrated with Dungeons & Dragons because... in D&D, you roll a d20 and you add a number based on your skill. Your skill can be quite high, but as your skill goes up, so too does the difficulty number, so it kind of wipes itself out, right? Balance is an issue, but you're essentially tied to what I call the chaos plateau, which is you roll a d20 and you hope. You just hope for a good result. Because the difficulty and your skill go up equally, the d20 is all that really matters. And so even if you've got a plus 10 at something, you're rolling that d20, you're adding plus 10, but you might be rolling against a DC 15 or a DC 20, and you're trying to do cool stuff that your character is supposedly good at, but you keep failing. You don't have any certainty of success. Because certainty in a role-playing game is a form of encouragement or reward. Now, it's subtle, right? What makes role-playing games magical is that players have the ability to try basically anything they want, right? They're not blocked off by a chain link fence. They could climb over it. They could cut it down. They could hit it with a car. They could call somebody to have it removed. They could seduce the god of chain link fences to move it for them. In RPGs, we're given rules that tell us not only whether we can or can't do something, but give us certainty around what will happen when we make the attempt, based on who and what our characters are. In a game about fighting, choosing the way in which you fight, right? I fight with skullduggery, I fight with magic, I fight with big swords. It matters, right? And it gives you more or less certainty as a form of reward for playing to that style. Let me give you an example about certainty in a game and how it tells us what a game cares about. Sagas of the Icelanders is a game that is very much about one thing. In Sagas of the Icelanders, you explore gender roles in a new agrarian society that has developed in 900 AD Iceland. It's about as niche as you can get. And it uses certainty to reinforce its themes. It's a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which means that in this case, all the characters in it have moves, which are basically telling you as a player what you're allowed to do without asking the GM for permission, right? If you're a woman in this game, if your character is a woman, you have a move that allows you to raise your voice and talk sense into someone. And when you do that, you will get one of 3 certain results, depending on how the dice land. But you know what might happen. If you're a man, you want to accept a physical challenge, it's the same. Now, however, a woman undergoing a physical challenge or a man trying to talk sense into somebody, they're at the mercy of the GM. They don't get to make that move. It would be like in D&D if only a fighter was able to fight, right? If a fighter could say, I attack the goblin and I roll my d20, and if I get higher than their armor class, I get to deal my damage. Everybody else who says, I attack the goblin with my sword, the GM just gets to decide. They get to say, no, I think the goblin kicks you in the nuts. You fall down. No, I think the goblin takes away your spellbook. Or like, yeah, I'm feeling merciful. Yes, wizard, you stab the goblin in the heart, right? We want certainty. And certainty is a reward for choosing certain character types or in certain games for everybody to create a narrative that allows us to understand what the game is about. Look at the game when you're picking up a new game. Look at mechanically what the characters can and can't do. This might be moves. This might be a skill list. This might be classes. But look at what the game gives you mechanisms for. Because those are the things that the game cares about. And those are the things that the game is going to want the players to be comfortable doing. And they will do more often. And the more often the players do something, the more it becomes part of your narrative. So if you're here and you're watching this, chances are pretty good that you're going to be the person at your group who suggests the new game, right? You're going to be the person who has to do the work understanding that game and who has to push a little bit to get it to the table. So here's a few common things people might say that get in the way of your fitting the right game to your system, what you can do to overcome that pushback. They might say, but we always play D&D. The question of trying a new system might be daunting for some people. They might be comfortable with what they've played before. They might have experience with it, or they might just believe it's possible to do anything with D&D or whatever game. You can help people get over that by questioning, first of all, why do you always play D&D? This protestation is usually something different. It's complaint about having to learn something new or fear about being not an expert anymore. It can be about game style, too. People with a gamist agenda might struggle with a game with a narrative focus. It might be about themes and tones, right? People might want what's familiar, which you can overcome by playing something new with familiar themes, right? We wrote Dungeon World just for this. Ask if the game that you are used to playing fits what we already talked about. People will bring this up after you have that inspiration conversation. I think usually the Socratic method can help you get past this one. Just ask more questions. But what if they say, I just don't want to play a new game. I refuse. This is the stubborn cry of someone who just straight up will not play anything other than their favorite game. It can be very hard to get over, and you might end up in a place where you just don't play with this person. But a few things that you can do to help them get over that might be explaining ways in which it's mechanically similar or different in ways that are interesting to them. Now, you have to have an understanding of their supreme fave, but it can be helpful to get that player on board. You know, if they only like Dungeons and Dragons, you can help them get comfortable with Torchbearer by saying, well, you know, you like Darkest Dungeon, right? You like D&D. Torchbearer is like D&D combined with Darkest Dungeon, right? Giving them things they can attach to. Often, we're more curious or interested than we think we are, but trying new things can be really daunting. So drawing parallels between the comfortable and the new can be really helpful for people. Explaining the places that fit into the scenario that you've already discussed can be really helpful, right? You want to explain to people that the right tool for the right job, because you've already kind of agreed on the job you want to do together. It's pretty hard to debate that. Probably the realest complaint a group can have, though, is that they don't have the money to buy a new system, or they don't have the time to learn one. Now, that one can be hard, right? You got to understand the game. You got to look at your group and figure out how many copies of any given book are actually needed and how many copies you can share given the technological and ethical concerns of your group, right? A lot of games have free versions with no art, or a Creative Commons version you can just access online. As well, a lot of games have their rules on the character sheet, but consider accessibility. It's much, much easier to get a group into a game of Fate than it is getting them into a game of Invisible Sun when money is a question. Now, this is a hard one, but a fair thing to complain about. And realizing it could be a limitation, addressing that together, there are usually ways to get past it, right? Everybody chips in for a copy of the game and we share it at the table. But I think being honest about that and listening, right? Recognizing that it is an actual and real complaint. But it's a tough one. So I hope that we've answered this already. I hope this question has answered itself through the slides, but to hammer it all home, think about choice of game this way. You and your players have a game in mind. It might be a setting or a scenario you're excited about. It might be themes or play style. It might include splashes of color or little narrative bits you're really excited about, and you're all on more or less the same page about it. And now that you've got your game desires mapped out, you need an engine that's going to make it all go. Your game, the game you choose, will have as much to say about the narrative as any given player does. Sometimes more. Through mechanisms, through setting, through random tables, and the way that the game handles things like success and failure, the game will get its grubby design fingerprints all over your campaign. And you want it to be doing that in the same colors that you've been painting in your head. You and your players are going to be hard at work crafting character and narrative motivations that make up your world, and you don't want the game creating drag on that sweet, sweet action. So choosing the right game is going to streamline and accentuate your play, rather than being an obstacle that you have to overcome. The right game is a fundamental foundation of a good campaign, and it's something that every group together should spend time considering before they sit down to play. And I hope that this lecture has provided you with some new tools to understand games better and to pick the right game for your group. Now, I know that I could have in this lecture just said, you know, here's Adam Koebel's top 10 role-playing games. Pick one of these. Or choose sci-fi, or choose fantasy, or choose Western, or here's 10 games that do romance well. But I don't want to tell you what game to play. I want to give you the tools so that you can critically analyze existing games so that you know which ones are good for your group, because I'm not going to be there at the table with you. It's you and your group that's going to be making this decision, and I want to empower you to do that better. So, if you have questions for me, and I know that our live viewing audience may or may not, but if you have any questions about today's topic, about choosing the right game, anything like that, I would be happy to answer them now. So I will give chat a moment to ponder it. And Sean brought this up in chat earlier on. Yeah, I didn't want to call Vampire out specifically as being one of those games that says it's one thing and is another thing, but I think it's a good classical example. I think Vampire and Call of Cthulhu both have a bit of a problem with saying that they're one thing and then mechanically trying to be just a broad like conflict resolution or a task resolution system, right? So they say this is a game about Lovecraftian horror, but the mechanics are really about like climbing ladders and shooting guns and getting in fistfights and stuff. Kind of base level conflict resolution, which isn't helpful for creating a narrative of personal horror. In the same way that the Vampire tends to say in its art and in its story, it tends to say this is a game about angst and horror and succumbing to the beast. But there are only a few rules in the game that actually do that. You know, I think that you can, as Mirror Shades proved, I think you can play a game whose mechanisms don't necessarily mesh with the themes of the game. Certainly, no one at FASA sat down in 1988 and said, you know, I hope that someday someone plays this like a dating sim, because there were no dating sims in 1988, but I think that you can definitely have a good time, and you can definitely bend a game, but it was a lot of work, and it will always be if the game is not designed to do the thing that you want to do. When overcoming pushback, when does it become less about overcoming and more about looking for a game to fit the player's wants? I never want to push someone too hard on that type of thing. Yeah, no, definitely. Like part of overcoming pushback is actually just listening to your players and understanding the difference between reticence and actual unwillingness to play, right? Someone who says, I don't want to learn another system, probably not as valid a complaint as I am not comfortable playing a game about romance, right? It's about listening to their pushback and understanding what makes them uncomfortable about that experience. And a lot of the time it's just, well, I don't want to learn a new game. I'm not interested in learning a new game. It sounds like too much effort. You know, pushback in that sense isn't about safety. And we'll talk a lot more about doing that kind of like safety work and stuff in session 0 when we get to that lecture. But in this case, it was more about people being resistant to new things. That kind of fear of learning a new system, fear about trying a new game, that resistance that some people have. Yeah, you wouldn't want to push too hard on somebody who like actually has like a legitimate reason not to engage in a new game. But remember, it's not our decision whether or not something is legitimate necessarily. We can do that as a group. And I think that most people are going to be honest if you say to them, you know, we all agreed we want to play a superhero game, but now you're saying you want to play Pathfinder. You understand how that's a conflict, right? I think that you can just access people that way as part of session 0. And hopefully the people you're playing with aren't going to push back just for its own sake. Or they're not going to be reticent and difficult just because they can. But yeah, I mean, role-playing games they're a social process. You want to do things that your players want to do. And I think that, you know, as I was saying kind of earlier on, that idea of asking questions instead of making statements is often, I mean, it's a great GM tool. It's the best GM tool, in fact. You can use it in social situations like session 0 to understand why people feel the way that they feel. Yeah. Is there a game you can recommend that isn't Burning Wheel to explore political intrigue and or day-to-day fantasy life? Is there a vehicle I can drive around and carry large amounts of cargo that isn't a truck or a van? Like, I mean, probably, but it's difficult for me to think of one that isn't a truck or a van. I need something that shoots bullets that isn't a gun. I mean, you know, there probably are. It depends on kind of what you... It depends on what you want tonally. Like, I think you could go with... I think Blue Rose has a little bit of kind of intrigue stuff, but it tends to be like romantic intrigue. I think that you could make Fate work for that because it's about characters in a similar way that... the Burning Wheel is. And I think if you're going for something a little less gritty and a little more like kind of open, I think that Fate might be a good choice for day-to-day political intrigue and fantasy life, because it lets you make a lot of statements about what play is going to be like. But yeah, I mean, obviously for me, that would be where I would go. I would go to Burning Wheel as well. But yeah, there's always more options. Sometimes though, those options mean designing your own thing or retooling something that already exists to make it fit what you want. And I guess that's a whole other thing that can come up, and actually kind of a great point. You might sit down, you might have session 0 with your players, and you might come up with a really specific idea of what you want. You might go out into the world, and you might realize, oh, this game doesn't actually exist. Like there is just no such game that will fit what we are trying to do. And that's a hard place to come to, because then you either need to hack something close or you need to become a game designer. And that's a whole other topic. But chances are pretty good you can find a game that'll fit your concept. And I think it's a good skill to be able to bend your concept a little bit to fit a game. I don't think that the concept you come up with in session 0 should be ironclad. I think that you come up with an idea and then you go out into the world and you find a game like that idea, and then you let the game's idea and your idea move together, like mush them together a little bit. Because I think you want to let the game surprise you. You want to give it room to have its own things to say. Yeah. So there you go. That's what I think. I mean, sometimes choosing the right game puts you in that revelation of like, there is no game that's going to fit. But hopefully you're not so far out in the deep end that doesn't exist yet. And every day, more and more weird RPGs get made. So, you know, hell, 5-10 years ago, if you had said to me, I want to play a role-playing game about the all-female Russian bomber squad in World War II, I would have said, well, good luck. Then now we have Night Witches. So, you know what? If you're not the one to design this wacky game that there is no game for, maybe someone else will. Maybe Jason Morningstar will do it for you. I don't know. Email him. Ask him to do it. So I think that should be enough to get you started, right? That should be enough to get you going on picking out your game, understanding your players' priorities, right? Are you a narrativist in a group of gamists? Is everybody looking for a particular experience? And hopefully with Jared's questions in hand. And you know what? If you want homework, and who doesn't want homework, pick up an RPG you haven't read before, right? Grab one from your PDF folder that you got in a bundle you haven't read before, and apply Jared's 3 questions to it. Figure out, what does this game tell me it's about? What are the mechanisms that reinforce that? And what are the player characters being rewarded for? And find out if it's a good game or not, right? I think it's a fun little experiment, and it'll definitely make you better at understanding games. At the very least, that's something that I think that you should try out. And I hope I will see you again next month for lecture number 3. We'll announce the topic in the Patreon soon. If you're watching this live, the Patreon Q&A with JP and I is on Tuesday. So we've got that post. And speaking of Patreon things, later this afternoon, I have the Far Verona faction turn. So it's all roleplay stuff all day for me. Hopefully I'll see all of you next time. And if not, we'll see you in the Discord or in the audience for our next show. Thanks for coming, everybody. See you next time.